again, everyone. Thanks for joining us again on Sunday School class with Ricky. Today we are going into our second lesson on the first missionary journeys found in the book of Acts, commonly referred to as Paul's missionary journeys. Last class, you will recall, we did a complete biography on the life of Paul. So for today's class, we're going to go back to the point where he starts the first missionary journey and talk a bit about that period. Now you will recall again, because we did mention during the presentation last time, that there was persecution by then Saul on the Christians who were in Jerusalem. And at that point, many of them fled Jerusalem back to their hometowns. Some went to Cyprus, some went to Phoenicia, and some went to Antioch. And as the Christians fled to those locations, of course, when they went there, they went and they preached the gospel to the people there. They preached, though, primarily to the Jews. And particularly in Antioch, we're told that they preached to the Greek-speaking Jews there, and many of them believed and were converted. When news of this conversion reached back to the elders who were in Jerusalem, they chose a man called Barnabas and sent him to Antioch to teach and encourage the new Christians there in that city. Barnabas, you will recall, was the person who brought Paul to the elders in Jerusalem when they were a bit scared of receiving him. And Barnabas brought Paul. At this time, as he went to Antioch, he then went to Paul and asked Paul to join him on the work in Antioch. So he and Paul went to Antioch. They spent a year there. Then they came back to Jerusalem with a gift to the Christians in Jerusalem from the Christians in Antioch because of the famine that was to occur there. They spent some time there in Jerusalem, and then having fulfilled their ministry there, they went back to Antioch, accompanied by a young man by the name of John Mark, who was to be their helper. And so John Mark, Barnabas, and Paul go back to Antioch, and it is from there that the first missionary journey starts. So it was my intention for today's class, the second lesson, to actually set off with them on the first missionary journey. My plan was to say a few brief words about the lives of Barnabas and John Mark, and then set off on the journey. However, I found that the lives of John Mark and Barnabas were so interesting that I felt that we could dedicate a whole class just to speaking about those two men. And that's what we will do. So today's class is about the lives of Barnabas and John Mark, the two men who accompanied Paul on that first missionary journey. So who were the people on the first missionary journey? Well, Paul we already spoke about. So let's speak a little bit about Barnabas. We first meet Barnabas in the book of Acts chapter 4 and verse 36. We are told that he was a Levite from Cyprus, and his name was actually Joseph or Joses. The disciples, the apostles there, called him Barnabas. And that's like a nickname. It says surnamed in the King James Version. It's really a nickname. Just like we give people nicknames today based on some characteristic, they nicknamed him Barnabas. And Barnabas means son of encouragement or son of exhortation. So you can get a picture now of how these apostles saw Barnabas. A person who was characterized by encouragement and exhortation, and we actually see that throughout the life of Barnabas. We see this, that particular reference I guess give there was Acts chapter 4 verses 36 and 37, and probably because of his obvious inclination towards serving others, they gave him that nickname. So already we see something about him. In Acts 4:37 we're told something else. We're told that he had some property, and he brought it, and he sold it, and he brought the proceeds and laid it at the feet of the apostles. So he was apparently a person of some social standing. He owned the property, so he had to be, fairly well off. And so he did that. When the Christians were now getting started, and there were many who were in need, Barnabas was one of the first ones, apparently, who took the step of selling something that he had and bringing the proceeds to the apostles so that it can be distributed to those who were in need. All right, let's contrast him quickly with the story you see in Acts 5 of Ananias and Sapphira. I'm not going to go into that story, but you probably know that story, where they did a similar thing. They sold a property, but they chose to keep part of the proceeds to themselves and then to lie about it. And of course, they didn't have to do that. They could have just said, we're keeping part for ourselves, and that would have been fine. But they chose to lie about it, and so they were judged because of that. Barnabas did not do that. He brought the full proceeds and gave it to the apostles for distribution to the needs of the other saints. As I mentioned already, we are told in Acts 9:27 that Barnabas was the one who took Paul and brought him to the brethren. Again, when Paul was first converted and came to Jerusalem, the disciples there didn't accept him. They were scared of him, rightfully so, or understandably so, I should say. And they didn't readily receive him. Barnabas was the one who took Saul at the time, and his name was Saul, and brought him to the apostles and encouraged them to accept him and to receive him into the fellowship. Now, this was a very courageous thing to do on Barnabas' part. He couldn't have known for sure 100% that Paul was sincere, but he had faith, and he took the opportunity to bring Paul to the apostles and have them receive him into the fellowship. As I mentioned already as well in my introduction, in Acts 11, the elders in Jerusalem sent Barnabas to Antioch to help with the ministry there. And again, this shows his willingness to be a person who's willing to be used for the purpose of the spread of the gospel and for the help of fellow Christians. And so he was willing, and so they took him. And that passage there says something very wonderful about Barnabas' character, and I'll read that passage. That's found in Acts 11, and I'll read from verse 22. Because prior to this, as I said earlier in my introduction, news came that the Christians, that there were people, Jewish people, Greek Jews in Antioch who heard the gospel and who repented and who got saved. And news came to the apostles in Jerusalem, and so they sent Barnabas to go and encourage the believers there. And from verse 22 it says there, news of this there being the salvation of the many Jews in Antioch, news of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. And when he came and saw the grace of God, he rejoiced, and he exhorted them all to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast devotion. For he, Barnabas, was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were brought to the Lord. That's taken from the New Revised Standard Version reading. And a wonderful thing to be said there of Barnabas. Just shows the kind of person he was. And again, we see there exhortation. That's what his name literally means, son of exhortation. Okay, so after this, the first missionary journey starts, and Barnabas continues with Paul for the entire first missionary journey. You will notice that the very first destination on that journey was the island of Cyprus. That, you recall, was Barnabas' hometown. That's where he was from. So you can see his keen desire to take the gospel back to his own people first of all. That shows a man who had a heart for his people. Again, the son of encouragement. So they set off on a missionary journey, and the first port was Cyprus, and of course they continued throughout the entire first missionary journey, which hopefully, Lord willing, we will get to next class and describe in detail what happened on that first journey. Today, again, is a summary of Barnabas' life. they went back at the end of that first missionary journey. They went back to Jerusalem, and in Acts, at the end of Acts 14, Acts 15, there's a big council meeting there where they had a big discussion on what the Gentiles should and should not do. Barnabas was part of that with Paul. And then at the end of that, at the end of Acts 15, Barnabas and Paul decided they were going to go out again on a second missionary journey to visit the people who they met on the first journey and to encourage them. However, that didn't quite go according to plan, because Barnabas was keen to go, but he was keen to take John Mark with them. And we'll speak about John Mark a bit later on, but the point is that at some point on the first missionary journey, John Mark departed from them, and Paul wasn't too pleased with that. And so when they were planning to start the second journey, Paul and Barnabas were going. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark. Paul did not agree with that, and there was a contention between the two, a disagreement, and Barnabas ends up going with John Mark again back to Cyprus, yet again back to Cyprus, his hometown, and going on his missionary journey in that direction. We do not hear anything about that journey in the book of Acts, but we know that he went with Mark to Cyprus. Well, Paul, on the other hand, went off on the second journey with Silas, which we'll come to eventually. All right, so just a bit more about Barnabas. Galatians 2:13, he's mentioned again. And this is the only slightly negative mention of Barnabas in Scripture. And this is the incident where Peter had come from Jerusalem to Antioch to visit the saints there. And apparently when Peter first came, he was fellowshipping with all the Gentiles and everyone, all the Jewish and Gentile Christians there, having good fellowship and eating with them and so on. But then something, James or some other of the elders said something about that and indicated that it was wrong. And so when Peter heard that, he decided he was going to stop eating and start fellowshipping with the Gentile Christians there, and he separated himself with them, and Barnabas did the same. Obviously influenced by Peter, Barnabas did the same thing, and he also shunned the Gentiles. And Paul tells us that he withstood them and he rebuked them openly, telling them that they were wrong and so on. But this is the only slightly negative mention of Barnabas in the Scripture. Interestingly, in Acts 14:14, Barnabas is referred to by the Greek word for apostle. So he's called an apostle. And I mention that because, of course, when we think of the apostles, we tend to think of the original 11 and then 12. But Barnabas actually is referred to as an apostle as well. I'm not going to discuss what the significance of that is. It's just an interesting thing to note. He's also mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 by Paul, and Paul used him as an example of someone who was laboring. And it is estimated that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around 56 or 57 AD. So that means that Barnabas was still alive around that time, around 56. And he's not mentioned again in the Bible. But there are a number of extra biblical references to Barnabas. Again, of course, I would say these are historical and these are traditions, traditional views that we hear. We do not know for sure, and we're just going by what the tradition says. But these are things that have been said about Barnabas from the historical or traditional perspective. Tertullian, who's a well-known early Christian, one of the church fathers, actually said that Barnabas was the author of the epistle to the Hebrews. That was Tertullian's view, widely considered to be just conjecture. We don't know that at all for a fact. There's no real evidence to support that, but except that Tertullian said it. There are also a number of other books and letters in circulation that bear his name. There is an epistle of Barnabas and a gospel of Barnabas. You can actually go and search for them online and have a look at them. But these documents dated by the scholars to probably the early 2nd century, like 110, 120 AD. And by then Barnabas certainly would have been dead. So it's very unlikely that these documents that bear his name actually were written by him. Very unlikely. Now, although the date and the place and the circumstances of Barnabas' death are not verifiable historically, there are some Christian traditions. And we are told by tradition that Barnabas was martyred at a place called Salamis on the island of Cyprus, where he was born. We are told that he was in the midst of preaching or in the midst of ministry, and some men came and grabbed him, and he was stoned to death. And that he was secretly buried by his companion, John Mark. That's tradition. That's what tradition tells us. We do not know that for a fact. We don't have any historical documents to tell us that, but that's what tradition reports. And of course, he's traditionally identified as the founder of the Cypriot Orthodox Church, and they have a feast day, the feast day of St. Barnabas, that is celebrated every year on the 11th of June. So that's Barnabas. That's what we hear about him from extra-biblical sources. It is estimated that Barnabas died somewhere between AD 57 and AD 61. Again, we have no literal date as to when, but sometime in that range, he probably died. Barnabas lived a good life, as we can see from his ministry. He started out strong, he continued strong, and he finished strong. A wonderful example of a Christian servant. The second person who was with Paul on that first missionary journey is a young man by the name of John Mark. We first encounter John Mark in Acts chapter 12 and verse 12, and we are told that he is the son of a lady called Mary, who apparently had a fairly large house in Jerusalem where the Christians met. This is where the story of when Peter was imprisoned, and then he was miraculously freed from prison. Peter headed straight for Mary's house where some Christians had gathered. So this suggests some kind of degree of closeness between Peter and that family. That's where he headed, and suggesting that there was some closeness between the family. And of course that closeness would also have included a closeness with John Mark himself, probably. It definitely seems that way. In Acts 12:25, as I mentioned earlier, when speaking about Barnabas, John Mark went to Antioch with Saul and Barnabas to be their helper. Not quite clear what his duties would have been. It just says he went there to be their minister or to be their helper. Probably just there to help them out with operational and logistical tasks. But he went to help out Saul and Barnabas when they went to minister in Antioch. And so when they set off in Acts 13 on that first missionary journey, he accompanied them. So it was Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark heading out from Antioch on that first journey. However, by the time we come to Acts 13 and verse 13, we are told fairly mysteriously that John Mark departs from them while at a place called Perga and returns to Jerusalem. We do not know why. For years now, I'm sure people have been speculating why did John Mark leave and go back to Jerusalem. We don't know for sure, but based on the story that as it developed, we can conclude that Paul didn't think it was a good reason for leaving. So it wasn't as though there was some urgency back in Jerusalem. Maybe his mother Mary was sick and he had to go back to take care of her. It didn't seem to be that the case, because Paul did not seem to think that it was a good decision for him to go back. Some people speculate that he left without even telling Paul and Barnabas that he was leaving, which would have caused, of course, them to be fully upset. But we don't know that. It does not say that in the Bible. We're just told, as I said, mysteriously, that he left them in Perga and returned to Jerusalem. Fairly important incident in his life. And so then when we come to Acts 15, as I just went through, the start of the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark back with them. Paul refused, again indicating Paul's displeasure with John Mark for having left them at Perga. And so he was not allowed to accompany Paul, but he did accompany John Mark, that is, did accompany Barnabas back to Cyprus, whilst Paul went with Silas elsewhere. We are told in Colossians 4 and verse 10, it mentions there that John Mark was likely the cousin of Barnabas. So that potentially could be why Barnabas seemed to be a little more forgiving, I guess, a little more willing to give him a second chance, possibly because they were cousins. John Mark is mentioned again in the book of Philemon, verse 24 of Philemon, when Paul is writing. And at this point, Paul, it seems as though he was present with Paul whilst Paul was writing that epistle. So time has passed, and it appears as though by this time there was some reconciliation between Paul and John Mark, because John Mark appeared to be with him when he was writing to Philemon. You can find that in Philemon verse 24. And then at the very end of Paul's life in 2 Timothy, we see there Paul mentions John Mark again and says, and Paul refers to him as being helpful to him. At this point now, full reconciliation. He's back in Paul's good books. They're friends once again, and Paul is saying that he is helpful to him in the ministry. And so despite that little wobble in his career at Perga, by the time we reach 2 Timothy, he has been restored. He's once again back in good fellowship, back in Paul's good books, and he ended his ministry well. Now it is believed, once again we're looking at some extra biblical type information. It is believed that this is the same Mark who wrote we call it the second gospel, because Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, so Mark appears second, so we say the second gospel. But Mark is actually the first gospel. I think most scholars would agree and tell you that Mark was the first gospel that was written. It's the oldest of the four gospels. The three synoptic gospels is the oldest of them. So he wrote the earliest, the oldest gospel we have is written by Mark, who it is believed to be this same John Mark that we are speaking about here in the book of Acts. That gospel is estimated to have been written between AD 55 and AD 59. Some people go as late as AD 68, but it's hard to pin down a date, but probably a little earlier than that, probably around 55 to 59 AD. And it is believed that Mark's gospel is a record of Peter's account of the life of Jesus. Remember back when we saw that when Peter was released from prison, he went straight to John Mark's house, well, John Mark's mother's house. So that again indicated that there was some connection, some closeness there between John Mark and Peter. He certainly would have known him. Certainly they would have been interacting and fellowshipping based on that story. And so it's quite possible and quite likely indeed that his account from the gospel is indeed Peter's account of the life of the Lord Jesus. The gospel itself does not mention Mark as the author. Actually, none of the gospels mentions a name of the author for them, but we are told by the traditions and by the early leaders, they attribute it to these persons, and they attribute this gospel of Mark to this person, John Mark. Early church figures such as the big names in early Christianity, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Clement, Tertullian, they all support the view that the second gospel, the first gospel, the gospel of Mark, was written by John Mark. It is said that he likely composed his gospel whilst living in Rome shortly after Peter's death. We have no record as to when John Mark may have died, but we do know that, or we do expect that he would have been in Rome at the time. However, we do know, based on his interactions and the words of Paul, that he finished strong. Just like Barnabas did, Mark finished strong also. Okay, so before we close this lesson, I just want to say a few brief words about the city of Antioch, which is where the first missionary journey set out from. Now you must remember this. The first missionary journey started in Antioch. You must remember that because there will be a quiz at the end of this course, and the first question will be, where did the first missionary journey start? And the answer is, of course, Antioch. Okay, I'm just kidding. There's actually no quiz, but remember it anyway. So Antioch, this is Antioch in Syria, and I mention that because when we do start on the actual first missionary journey, we will come to another place called Antioch in Pisidia. But Antioch was a fairly common name because of some of the history I'll give you now briefly. So there were more than one Antioch, but this one was Antioch in Syria. So Antioch was founded near the end of the 4th century BC by Seleucus I, and he was one of Alexander the Great's generals. And if you have been with me on these videos, on these lessons from the very beginning, you may recall that my very first lesson was about started with Alexander the Great and then the breakup of his kingdom. And one of the 4 men who took over bits of Alexander's kingdom was a man called Seleucus, and he took over what is now called Syria, what was called back then Syria, and he founded the city of Antioch. He named it after his father, who was a man called Antiochus, and of course you would also remember that there were a number of kings of Syria after him, after Seleucus, who were all called Antiochus. So Antioch was named after his father. In 63 BC, Antioch was taken over by Rome. This is when Pompey the Great came from Rome and took over that part, and Rome occupied and annexed that part of the world at the time. They took over Syria, took over Israel, it took over that whole area. That's 63 BC. So Antioch then became, because of its size and so on, it became the 3rd most important city in the entire Roman Empire, only after Rome itself and Alexandria in Egypt. The 3rd most important would have been Antioch, and it was the capital of the Syrian province back then. Today, Antioch is called Antakya, and it is located, of course, in modern-day Turkey. But back in the 1st century, the city's location offered great geographical, military, and economic benefits to its occupants. It was heavily involved in the spice trade. In the 1st century, Antioch's population may have reached a peak of over 500,000 inhabitants. So you can see it was a large place, lots of people, ripe for people hearing the gospel. It was also the main location for Hellenistic Judaism, that is, the Jews who were more Greek-oriented, who were Jews but tend to follow a lot of the Greek practices and so on within their own, incorporated them into their own views. So you found lots of that in Antioch. So it was the main center for that Hellenistic Judaism back then and around the 1st century. But then, of course, Antioch, as we know, is called the cradle of Christianity because of the pivotal role that it played in the emergence of early Christianity. The name Christian first emerged in Antioch. And so it is from this location that Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark set off on that first missionary journey. This is my challenge to you for today. We saw the lives of 2 men, Barnabas and John Mark. Now Barnabas is someone that we would all like to be like him. The son of encouragement, the one who would have been there to encourage Paul, the one who would have been willing to give of his possessions, sell his possessions and give to the poor. A wonderful, strong, solid Christian. And it appeared as though he remained that way throughout his Christian life. A man no doubt to be emulated, to be admired as a Christian. He started strong, he continued strong, and by all accounts, he finished strong, possibly being martyred for the preaching of the gospel. A wonderful man to admire. And then we have John Mark, who was obviously born into a family that was Christian and was involved in the ministry, had Christians gathering in his mother's house, so he would have been part of that. And then of course went off to work with Paul and Barnabas and set off on the first missionary journey. Started very strong, but he encountered a brief wobble in his Christian life where it appeared as though he may have made a mistake. Again, we can't say this definitively, we don't know for sure, but it appears as though, or it is possible that he made a mistake and possibly took a wrong turn in his life. Now that is something that all of us, I'm sure, could relate to. Many of us have made mistakes, have made wrong turns in our lives. But this wrong turn did not derail John Mark's Christian life. Very soon thereafter, we see Barnabas was willing to take him with him on that second missionary journey. So clearly by then, there was already some level of reconciliation going on. And then by the end of his life, we see that by then Paul was encouraged by him and had reconciled with him and considered him to be an asset to the ministry. In other words, John Mark also finished strong. And that's my challenge today. I want to encourage you, whatever happens in your life, whatever has happened in the past, make sure that you finish strong. And of course, we do not know when we're going to finish. So that means that we have to be strong now. And make sure that we finish strong. Make sure that we understand what God's will for us is and that we are obedient to it. Mistakes will be made. That's an unfortunate fact of life, an unfortunate aspect of our Christian lives. Mistakes will be made, but God is in the business of rectifying mistakes, forgiving sins, and restoring people. And if you believe that you've made a mistake, you've taken a wrong turn, God is willing to get you back on the right path, even just as he did for John Mark. And you too, like John Mark, like Barnabas, can finish strong. So finish strong. Do not allow yourself to remain in that state of weakness and futility. Get back on track, get back on the path that God wants you to be on, and finish strong. That's my challenge for you today, and I trust that you will do that. And if I could be a little bit like Barnabas and be a means of exhorting and encouraging you to do that, that's my desire to do today. Our next class, we're going to be, hopefully now, actually setting out on that first missionary journey with those three men. And we trust that you'll join us for that, and we look forward to the interesting things that would occur on that journey. So I'll see you in our next class. And until then, may God bless you.